Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The memories refuse to fade no matter how many years pass or how many times you try to bury them. Mine is from a Wednesday night in March of 2008, when I was 9 years old and still believed that locked doors could keep out anything dangerous. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a brick building in Newark, New Jersey, one of those places where the hallways always smelled like other people's cooking and the elevator broke down at least twice a month. My dad worked at a distribution warehouse during the day, loading trucks and managing inventory, while my mom stayed home with me and my baby brother Mateo, who had just turned 8 months old and was in that phase where he drooled on absolutely everything. Our apartment was small, but my mom made it feel warm. With yellow curtains she had sewn herself and family photos covering every inch of wall space in the living room. I shared a room with Mateo at first, but a few months before that night my parents had converted the tiny storage closet at the end of the hallway into a bedroom just for me. It barely fit a twin mattress and a small dresser, but I loved it because it had a door that locked from the inside, a detail that would end up saving my life. My dad had been acting different in the weeks leading up to that night, though at 9 years old I did not have the words to describe what I was sensing. He came home later than usual, sometimes not until after I was already in bed, and I would hear him and my mom talking in hushed, urgent voices in the kitchen. Their conversations had a sharpness to them that made my stomach tight, even when I could not make out the actual words through my bedroom wall. Sometimes he would get phone calls on his cell and walk out onto the balcony to take them, pacing back and forth with his hand pressed against his forehead, like he was trying to hold something inside his skull. I asked my mom once if everything was okay, and she smiled that smile parents use when they are lying to protect you and said everything was fine, that Poppy was just tired from working extra shifts. I wanted to believe her. That Wednesday had been a normal day. School, homework at the kitchen table while my mom made rice and beans, playing peekaboo with Mateo until he laughed so hard he got the hiccups. My dad came home around 7, kissed my forehead, and barely touched his dinner. He kept checking his phone, kept glancing toward the front door like he was expecting someone. I went to bed at 9 like always and locked my little door out of habit. I woke up to the sound of our front door being kicked in. It was not like in the movies, where there is a dramatic crash and then silence. It was loud and fast and followed by shouting, deep male voices yelling things I could not understand at first, words blurring together into something that sounded like violence itself. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my ears, behind my eyes. I sat up in my little bed, pressing my back against the wall, and tried to make sense of what was happening on the other side of my locked door. I heard my mom scream, a sound I had never heard her make before, raw and terrified in a way that made her sound like a completely different person. Then my dad's voice, higher than normal, saying something like, "I told you I needed more time," over and over again. More yelling, something heavy hitting the floor. And then Mateo started crying from his crib in my parents' room, that piercing wail that babies make when they are truly frightened. And nobody went to comfort him. Nobody could. I pressed my ear against my bedroom door, trying to understand what was happening without making any noise. Through the thin wood, I could hear at least 3 different voices, maybe 4, and they were not speaking English. They sounded Eastern European, maybe Russian or Ukrainian, with accents that turned their words into something harsh and guttural. One of them kept repeating a number, something like 40,000, and every time he said it, my dad would respond in this broken, pleading voice that did not sound like my father at all. I heard my mom crying, asking them not to hurt anyone, promising that they would get the money somehow. One of the men laughed at that, this short, cruel sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the apartment. I wanted to open my door and run to my parents to make sure they were okay, but my body would not move. It was like my muscles had turned to stone, like some ancient survival instinct had taken over, and was screaming at me to stay hidden, to stay silent, to not let them know I existed. So I stayed pressed against that door, barely breathing, while my whole world fell apart on the other side. The violence escalated in waves. I heard what sounded like furniture being overturned, glass breaking, my mother begging in Spanish mixed with English. One of the men shouted at her to shut up, and then there was a sharp sound, like a slap, maybe something worse, followed by a thud and more crying. My dad started yelling then, really yelling, telling them to leave her alone, that she had nothing to do with this, that it was his debt and they should deal with him. Another impact, heavier this time, and my dad made this grunting noise that I still hear sometimes when I close my eyes. Mateo was screaming now, not just crying, but screaming in that way babies do when they sense real danger, and no one was going to him. I wanted so badly to help, to do something, but I was 9 years old, and there were grown men in my apartment hurting my parents, and I did not even have a phone to call for help. My room had no window. It used to be a storage closet, remember? So I could not climb out or signal to anyone. I was trapped in a box at the end of a hallway, listening to my family being terrorized, and all I could do was stay quiet and hope they forgot I existed. That hope shattered when I heard footsteps coming down the hallway toward my door. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, like whoever was walking knew exactly where they were going. My mom started screaming again, different this time. She was screaming my name, telling me to hide, telling me not to open the door no matter what. Her voice cracked into something raw and desperate, and one of the other men must have done something to silence her because she went quiet in the middle of my name. The footsteps stopped right outside my room. I could see the shadow of feet blocking the thin line of light at the bottom of the door. There was a pause, maybe 2 seconds, maybe an eternity, and then the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. The lock held, that cheap little brass lock that came with the door when my parents converted the closet, and I remember thinking it was never meant to keep anyone out. It was just meant to give a 9-year-old girl some privacy. Now it was the only thing between me and whoever was on the other side. The man on the other side of the door started talking, and his voice was different from the others, lower, rougher, with a thickness to it that made every word sound like a threat. He spoke in accented English, slow and deliberate, asking who was in here. I did not answer. I could not answer. I had backed myself into the corner farthest from the door, wedged between my dresser and the wall, making myself as small as possible. He asked again, louder this time, and when I still did not respond, he switched to a different tone entirely. He started describing what he was going to do when he got inside. The things he said, I will not repeat them here, not even after all these years. They were things no child should ever hear, things that painted pictures in my mind I have spent my entire adult life trying to erase. He was enjoying himself. I could hear it in his voice, this sick pleasure he was taking in terrorizing whoever was hiding behind this flimsy door. He did not know I was 9. He did not know I was a little girl clutching her knees to her chest and trying not to cry loud enough for him to hear. Or maybe he did know, and that made it worse. Then he started kicking the door. The first kick made the whole frame shudder, and I watched the wood splinter slightly near the lock. The second kick was harder, and I heard the hinges groan in protest. I was crying now. I could not help it, these silent tears streaming down my face while I bit down on my own hand to keep from screaming. On the third kick, a crack appeared in the door itself, running diagonally from the lock toward the top corner. He was going to get in. The lock was not going to hold. I was going to die in this tiny room that used to make me feel so grown up and independent, and my parents were not going to be able to save me because they were being held down in the living room by men who wanted money my father apparently owed. I thought about Mateo, still crying somewhere in the apartment, and I wondered if anyone would be left to take care of him. I thought about my mom's yellow curtains and the gold star sticker my teacher had given me that week, and how none of it mattered anymore. The man kicked again, and this time the crack widened. I could see a sliver of the hallway light through the damaged wood. And then another voice cut through the chaos, sharp, commanding, furious. Someone was yelling at the man trying to break down my door, yelling in that same foreign language but with an authority that made everything stop. The kicking stopped. The man outside my door said something back, defensive and angry, but the other voice overrode him immediately. I heard footsteps, multiple sets now, and then what sounded like a scuffle in the hallway just feet from where I was hiding. The commanding voice kept repeating something, and even though I did not understand the words, I understood the tone. He was telling the other man to back off. There was more arguing, voices overlapping, and then a single phrase in English that I will never forget as long as I live. The commanding voice said, clear as anything, "There are children here. We do not do this. We are not animals." The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it stretched out like hours in my memory. Then the footsteps retreated back down the hallway, away from my door, and I heard the men gathering in the living room again. I stayed in my corner, not moving, barely breathing, listening to what came next. The tone of the encounter had shifted entirely. The commanding voice, I think he must have been the leader, or at least someone with enough authority to control the others, was speaking to my father now, still angry but more controlled. He said something about this being a warning, about the next time being different, about 40,000 being pocket change compared to what they would take if my father did not pay. My dad's voice came back weak and shaky, promising he would get the money, promising he just needed 2 more weeks. There was a long pause, and then the leader said something I could not quite hear, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps moving toward the front door. They were leaving. I heard the broken front door scrape against the floor as they pulled it partially closed behind them, heard their footsteps echoing down the exterior hallway, heard the stairwell door slam shut. And then there was just the sound of my mother sobbing in the living room, my father groaning in pain, and Mateo still wailing from his crib. All the sounds of a family that had just been shattered into pieces I did not know how to put back together. I do not know how long I stayed in that corner before I finally unlocked my door. It could have been 5 minutes or 30. Time had stopped making sense the moment our front door was kicked in. When I finally stepped into the hallway, I saw my cracked bedroom door hanging crooked on its hinges, saw the gouge marks in the wood where that man had tried to break through. The living room looked like a tornado had torn through it. Our coffee table was overturned, one leg snapped clean off. The TV screen was shattered. My mom's yellow curtains had been ripped down from one side, hanging limp and defeated against the wall. My dad was sitting on the floor with his back against the couch, holding a dish towel to his face that was already soaked through with blood. His left eye was swollen shut and turning purple, and there was a gash above his eyebrow that probably needed stitches but would never get them because we were not going to the hospital. We were not going to the police. I understood that without anyone telling me, even at 9 years old. My mom was kneeling next to him, shaking so hard her teeth were chattering, trying to clean blood off his face while tears streamed down her own. I went to get Mateo from his crib because nobody else could. He was soaked in sweat, his little face red and blotchy from screaming for so long, and when I picked him up he clung to me like I was the only solid thing left in his world. Maybe I was. I carried him into the living room and sat down next to my parents, and the 4 of us just stayed there on the floor for what felt like hours. Nobody talked. There was nothing to say. Eventually, my dad looked at me with his one good eye and said he was sorry, his voice cracking on the word in a way I had never heard before. He said he had made a mistake, that he had gotten involved in something he should not have, that he was going to fix it, and this would never happen again. I wanted to ask what kind of something, wanted to demand answers that made sense of how strangers could kick down our door and hurt my family over money. But I looked at his broken face and my mother's trembling hands and my baby brother's tear-streaked cheeks, and I realized that answers would not change anything. The damage was already done. We moved out of that apartment 2 weeks later, left everything we could not fit in our car, and drove to my aunt's place in Pennsylvania without looking back. My dad never told me exactly what he had been involved in, and I stopped asking after a while. I pieced together fragments over the years, overheard conversations, slips of the tongue, The way certain topics made my parents go quiet and exchange looks loaded with things they would never say out loud. From what I gathered, he had been running some kind of side operation through his warehouse job, moving goods that were not supposed to be moved, skimming money from people who did not take kindly to being skimmed from. He thought he could get away with it long enough to pay off some debts we had, maybe get us into a better apartment, give us a better life. Instead, he nearly got us killed. We stayed with my aunt for almost a year before my parents found jobs, and we could afford our own place again. My dad worked 2 legitimate jobs after that, day shift and night shift, 7 days a week until the circles under his eyes became permanent. He paid back what he owed. I do not know how, and I do not want to know. And those men never came for us again. But the man he used to be, the one who made silly voices when he read me bedtime stories, never fully came back either. I am 26 now, and I still cannot sleep with my bedroom door unlocked. Every apartment I have ever lived in, the first thing I do is check the locks, test the doors, map out where I would hide if someone broke in. I flinch at loud noises. I panic when I hear footsteps in hallways late at night. For years I had nightmares about that cracked door, about the sliver of hallway light widening as the wood gave way, about what would have happened if that other man had not intervened. Sometimes I wonder about him, the one who stopped it. I wonder if he had children of his own, if that is why he drew the line where he did. I wonder if he ever thinks about the little girl he saved without even knowing her name. My therapist says I have made incredible progress, that I have built a life despite carrying this weight, and maybe she is right. But there are still nights when I wake up in the dark, heart pounding, convinced I can hear heavy footsteps coming down the hallway toward my door. And I lie there, barely breathing, 9 years old again, waiting for the kicking to start. My cousin graduated high school the same year I started 2nd grade, which should give you an idea of how small I was compared to the older kids in our neighborhood. We lived in a suburb outside of Denver, one of those places where new developments kept popping up faster than families could fill them. There was this one section about 3 blocks from my house, a half-finished housing project that had stalled when the construction company ran out of money. The frames of houses stood like wooden skeletons, surrounded by dirt piles, abandoned equipment, and all sorts of debris that became our unofficial playground. My mom worked double shifts at the hospital back then, and my dad had moved to Seattle after the divorce, so I spent most of my summer days roaming around with whatever kids would let me tag along. I was small for my age, quiet, the kind of kid who laughed at jokes I did not understand just to feel included. That summer of 2008 changed something inside me permanently, and even now, almost 2 decades later, I still check twice before entering any enclosed space. The older kids in the neighborhood had a loose hierarchy that I never fully understood, but I knew enough to recognize that being invited to hang out with them was supposed to be an honor. There was this kid named Trent Holloway who lived at the end of Birchwood Lane. He was maybe 13 or 14, tall with a buzz cut and a chipped front tooth he claimed came from a fight, but probably happened falling off his bike. His younger brother Shane was 12, built like a refrigerator, always wearing the same faded Denver Broncos jersey regardless of the weather. A girl named Kelsey from 2 streets over hung around them constantly, freckled and mean in that casual way some kids perfect by middle school. There were others who drifted in and out, neighborhood kids whose names I barely remember now. But those 3 were the core group. They found me walking alone near the construction site that Wednesday morning, kicking rocks and pretending I had somewhere important to be. Trent called out to me, asked if I wanted to see something cool they found in the unfinished houses. I should have kept walking. I followed them through a gap in the chain-link fence that was supposed to keep people out of the construction site. The metal had been peeled back so many times by neighborhood kids that it curved permanently outward like a wound that refused to heal. We walked past stacks of warped plywood, rusted rebar poking out of concrete slabs, and a bulldozer that had not moved in so long that weeds had started growing through its treads. The July sun was brutal that day, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the dirt and turned every metal surface into a branding iron. Trent led the way with Shane right behind him, and Kelsey walked next to me, close enough that her elbow kept bumping mine. She asked me questions about school, about my mom, about whether I'd ever kissed a girl. I answered everything, desperate to seem cool, not realizing she was gathering ammunition. The deeper we walked into the site, the more isolated I felt. The sounds of cars and lawnmowers faded until all I could hear was our footsteps crunching on gravel and the occasional creak of unstable wood settling in the heat. They brought me to what was supposed to be the basement of one of the unfinished houses. The walls were poured concrete, gray and cold despite the summer heat, and the floor was just packed dirt with puddles of stagnant water in the corners. Construction materials were scattered everywhere: pipes, wooden beams, bags of hardite cement that had absorbed moisture and turned solid. But the thing that caught my attention was this massive barrel sitting against the far wall. It was industrial-sized, the kind you see on the back of trucks carrying chemicals or industrial waste, maybe 4 feet tall and wide enough that I could have fit inside with room to spare. The plastic was dark blue, faded and scratched, with a lid that had been removed and set aside. Trent walked over to it and slapped the side, and the hollow boom echoed off the concrete walls. He turned to me with this grin that showed his chipped tooth and asked if I wanted to see what was inside. Shane and Kelsey were already moving to position themselves between me and the only way out, a wooden ramp that led up to ground level. I did not notice that at the time. I was too focused on trying to impress them, too eager to prove I was not scared of anything. Trent told me the barrel was a time machine. He said it with a straight face, like he was letting me in on a secret the other kids in the neighborhood did not know about. If you climbed inside and closed your eyes, you could travel anywhere you wanted. That was the game. Shane nodded along, adding that he had done it twice already and gone back to see dinosaurs. Kelsey said she had visited the future and seen flying cars. Even at 7 years old, I knew they were lying. I knew this was some kind of trick. But the way they were all looking at me, waiting, expectant, made my legs move toward that barrel anyway. I told myself I would just look inside, just peek over the edge to see what was in there. The inside was dark, stained with something brown that could have been rust or dirt or something worse. It smelled like old rainwater and chemicals. Trent put his hand on my shoulder, friendly, encouraging, and asked if I was brave enough to try it. His grip was tighter than it needed to be. I said sure I would try it. I still remember the exact moment I decided to climb in, the way my sneakers squeaked against the plastic rim, the way the barrel wobbled slightly under my weight. I thought I was being brave. I thought this was what it took to finally belong. The second I was fully inside, everything changed. The barrel was deep enough that when I crouched down, my head was below the rim. The plastic walls curved around me, slick and cold against my arms. I heard Trent say something to the others, and then there was a scraping sound, the lid. They were putting the lid back on. I shot up immediately, tried to push against it, but Shane was already pressing down with both hands. The lid was not designed to lock, but it fit snugly into a groove at the top of the barrel. And with someone holding it in place, there was no way I could push it off from inside. I started yelling, asking them to stop, telling them this was not funny. Through the thin plastic, I could hear them laughing. Kelsey made her voice high and mocking, imitating my panic, and the other two laughed even harder. I pounded on the walls with my fists, kicked at the bottom, screamed until my throat burned. The air inside was already getting thick, hot, hard to breathe. Every exhale bounced back at me from the curved walls, warm and damp against my face. I begged them to let me out. I used the word please over and over, something I had been taught meant people had to listen. They did not listen. They just kept laughing, their voices distorted through the plastic like sounds from another world. Time stopped making sense inside that barrel. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour, I had no way of knowing. The heat was unbearable, sweat pouring down my face and stinging my eyes, my shirt soaked through and sticking to my skin. I tried to calm down. tried to breathe slowly like my mom had taught me when I had nightmares, but every breath felt like it was not enough. The walls seemed to press closer with each passing second, even though I knew that was impossible. I could hear them talking outside, their voices casual now, bored even. Shane asked Trent how long they should keep me in there. Trent said until I stopped crying, then maybe a little longer to teach me a lesson. Kelsey suggested they go get sodas from her house and come back later. The idea that they might leave me there, alone in the dark, made something inside me snap. I started screaming again, not words anymore, just raw sound tearing out of my throat. I clawed at the lid, at the walls, felt my fingernails bend backward against the hard plastic. One of them broke, and I felt the sharp sting of blood on my fingertip. But I did not stop. I could not stop. Every instinct in my body was telling me I was going to die in that barrel, suffocated and forgotten in the basement of a house that would never be finished. Then I heard a different sound, a deep, low groan that did not come from any of the kids. The barrel shifted beneath me, tilting slightly to one side. I heard Kelsey say something, her voice suddenly uncertain, and Shane asked what that noise was. The groan came again, louder this time, followed by a cracking sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I did not understand what was happening, but I felt the barrel move again, sliding a few inches across the dirt floor. Outside, Trent shouted something I could not make out, and then there was chaos. Footsteps running, voices overlapping, another crack that sounded like wood splitting. The barrel tipped further, and I braced myself against the curved walls, my heart pounding so hard. I could feel it in my teeth. Something was wrong with the structure above us. Later, I would learn that the wooden supports holding up the floor of the house above the basement had been rotting for months, weakened by rain and neglect. The weight of the construction materials stored up there, the pipes, the bags of cement, the leftover lumber, had finally become too much. The floor was collapsing, and I was trapped directly underneath it. The first piece of debris hit the barrel like a hammer. A wooden beam, maybe, or a chunk of concrete. I never found out exactly what it was. The impact dented the plastic inward, pressing against my shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise that would last for weeks. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the collapse, cracking, crashing, the thunder of heavy objects falling. The barrel rolled, and suddenly I was tumbling inside it, my head slamming against the walls, my elbows and knees scraping against the rough plastic. Dust poured in through the seam where the lid met the rim, filling my mouth and nose, making me choke. I curled into a ball, made myself as small as possible, and prayed to a God I had only heard about in Sunday school. The world outside was ending, or at least it sounded that way. I felt something massive land on top of the barrel, pressing the lid down so hard that the plastic groaned under the strain. For one terrible moment, I was certain the whole thing would crush inward and flatten me like an insect. But the barrel held. It was industrial grade, built to survive being dropped off trucks and dragged across warehouse floors. That cheap, ugly blue plastic container became the only thing standing between me and a ton of falling rubble. When the noise finally stopped, the silence was almost worse. I could not move. The barrel was wedged at an angle, pinned in place by whatever had landed on top of it, and the space inside had shrunk, the dented walls pressing against me from multiple directions. I could feel blood trickling down my forehead, warm and sticky, mixing with the sweat and dust on my face. My left arm was twisted under my body, throbbing with a pain that told me something was probably broken. I tried to call for help, but my voice came out as a whisper, my throat too raw from screaming. I did not know if the other kids were still there. I did not know if anyone would ever find me. The air was thick with dust, and every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the settling sounds of debris shifting above me, and I made myself a promise. If I got out of this alive, I would never let anyone trap me anywhere ever again. I would never be small and quiet and desperate to belong. I would become someone who could not be pushed into barrels and forgotten. It was a childish promise, the kind you make when you think you are about to die, but I meant every word of it. I do not know how long I was in there after the collapse. It felt like hours, but it was probably closer to 20 or 30 minutes. What saved me was a man named Harold Finch, a retired electrician who lived on the other side of the construction site. He had been walking his dog when he heard the crash, and unlike most people who would have just called the authorities and waited, Harold grabbed a flashlight from his garage and went to investigate. I learned all of this later, of course. In the moment, all I knew was that suddenly there was a voice calling out, asking if anyone was there. I tried to answer, tried to yell, but all that came out was a weak croak. It was enough. Harold heard me. He started pulling debris away, piece by piece, working carefully so nothing else would shift and collapse further. I could hear him grunting with effort, cursing under his breath, calling out to me every few seconds to keep talking so he could follow the sound. When he finally pulled the lid off that barrel and I saw his face, weathered, covered in dust, eyes wide with shock, I burst into tears. He lifted me out like I weighed nothing, cradled me against his chest, and carried me up the wooden ramp and out into the sunlight. The brightness hurt my eyes after so long in the dark. I remember thinking that the sky had never looked so blue, so impossibly endless after being trapped in that tiny curved space. The ambulance came, and then the police. My mom arrived still wearing her hospital scrubs, mascara running down her face, trembling so hard she could barely hold me. I had a fractured wrist, a concussion, and cuts that needed stitches across my forehead and both hands. The doctors said I was lucky. If the barrel had been positioned a few feet in either direction, if it had not been industrial grade, if Harold Finch had decided to just call 911 and wait instead of going in himself, I would have been crushed. Trent, Shane, and Kelsey had run the moment the structure started groaning. They told their parents they had been playing in Kelsey's backyard all morning, and for a few days, it looked like they might get away with it. But Harold had seen them fleeing the site, and I eventually told the police everything. There were meetings with lawyers, tearful apologies from parents who could not believe their children would do something like that, promises that it would never happen again. The Holloways moved away before the summer ended. I heard later that Trent got sent to some kind of behavioral program in another state. Kelsey's family stayed, but she never looked at me again, not once, like I had become invisible the moment I stopped being useful to torment. I did not care. I was alive, and that was the only thing that mattered. It has been almost 20 years since that day, and I wish I could tell you the memory has faded into something manageable, something I can look back on without feeling my chest tighten. But trauma does not work that way, at least not for me. I still cannot use elevators without my heart rate spiking. I avoid MRI machines, phone booths, any space where the walls feel too close. A few years ago, my girlfriend at the time suggested we try one of those escape room experiences for her birthday, and I had to leave the waiting area before we even started. Just seeing the small rooms on the promotional photos was enough to make me dizzy. I have done therapy, tried different medications, learned breathing techniques that sometimes help and sometimes do not. The claustrophobia is manageable now most days, but it never fully goes away. It lives in my body like a second heartbeat, quiet until something triggers it, and then suddenly I am 7 years old again, curled up in the dark, listening to other children laugh while I beg to be let out. The worst part is not the fear itself, it is knowing exactly where it came from, knowing that it was planted in me deliberately by kids who thought my terror was entertainment. I looked up Trent Holloway a few years ago, just out of curiosity. He is an insurance adjuster now, living somewhere in Texas, married with 2 kids based on his social media. He looks normal, happy even, like a man who has never done anything worth regretting. I do not know if he ever thinks about that day, about the boy he shoved into a barrel and left to die. Probably not. People have a remarkable ability to forget the harm they cause when they are young, to file it away as just kids being kids. But I remember. I remember the sound of the lid scraping into place, the echo of my own screams bouncing off plastic walls, the weight of the world collapsing on top of me. I remember Harold Finch's face when he pulled me out, the way he kept saying, "It is okay. You are okay, son," even though we both knew nothing about that situation was okay. I sent Harold a card every Christmas until he passed away 6 years ago. His family invited me to the funeral, and I stood in the back and cried for a man who had no obligation to save me, but did it anyway. That is the thing about people. Some of them will lock you in barrels and laugh, and some of them will dig through rubble with their bare hands to pull you out. I got to meet both kinds before I turned 8 years old. I try to be the second kind now, every single day. It is the only thing that makes the memory bearable. My mom still apologizes for that Saturday in March of 2015, even though I keep telling her it was not her fault. I had just turned 10 a few weeks before, and we lived in this small 2-bedroom house on Crescent Lane in a quiet neighborhood outside of Portland, Oregon. My parents had divorced when I was 6, so it was just me and Mom most of the time. She worked as a nurse at a clinic downtown, and that particular weekend she was supposed to be off. Our neighbor's daughter, a college girl named Heather, usually watched me whenever Mom had to leave, but Heather had called that morning saying she caught some stomach bug and could barely get out of bed. Mom tried 3 other people, but nobody was available on such short notice. I remember her pacing the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, looking more stressed than I had ever seen her. The emergency was my grandmother. She had fallen in her apartment across town, and the building manager found her on the bathroom floor, conscious but unable to get up. Mom explained everything to me in that serious voice she used when she needed me to understand something important. She said she would be gone for 1 hour, maybe less, and that I should not open the door for anyone, not answer the phone unless it was her number on the caller ID, and stay inside no matter what. She made me repeat the rules back to her twice. I was a responsible kid, always had been, and I think she trusted me more than most parents would trust a 10-year-old. She kissed my forehead, grabbed her keys, and backed out of the driveway in her old blue Subaru. I watched through the front window until the car disappeared around the corner, and then I was alone. The house felt different immediately, bigger somehow, like the walls had stretched outward the moment she left. I decided to watch cartoons to pass the time. I grabbed the remote, curled up on the couch with my favorite blanket, the green one with little white stars that my dad had given me before he moved to Seattle, and flipped to a channel playing old Scooby-Doo episodes. The clock on the wall read 11:42. Mom said she would be back by 12:30 at the latest. I remember doing the math in my head, thinking that was only 48 minutes away, not even a full hour of cartoons. The sun was bright outside, streaming through the curtains, and everything felt normal. Our cat, a fat orange tabby named Pumpkin, jumped onto the couch and curled up against my legs. I scratched behind his ears and focused on the screen, where Shaggy and Scooby were running from a guy in a monster costume. I must have been watching for about 15 minutes when the first knock came. It was soft, almost polite. 3 gentle taps on the front door. Pumpkin lifted his head, ears rotating toward the sound like little satellite dishes. I muted the television and sat very still. Mom had been clear about not opening the door, but she had not said anything about not looking. I slid off the couch and crept toward the front window, staying low the way I had seen people do in movies. The curtains had a small gap where they did not quite meet in the middle, and I pressed my eye to that gap, trying to see the porch. There was a man standing there. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark green jacket and jeans. He had a clipboard in one hand and a baseball cap pulled low on his forehead, the kind of cap with no logo, just plain gray fabric. He did not look scary exactly, but something about the way he stood bothered me. He was too still, like he was listening rather than waiting. He knocked again, harder this time. 4 sharp raps that made the door rattle in its frame. I pulled back from the window and pressed my back against the wall, heart beating fast in my chest. Pumpkin had jumped off the couch and was standing in the hallway, tail puffed up to twice its normal size, staring at the door. Then the man spoke. His voice was calm, friendly even, the kind of voice a teacher might use when explaining something to a student. He said he was from the electric company, that there had been some reports of power surges in the neighborhood, and he needed to check our meter. He said it would only take a minute. I stayed frozen against the wall, barely breathing, remembering what Mom had told me. Do not open the door for anyone. The man waited a few seconds, then knocked again, louder now, the friendly tone slipping from his voice like a mask falling off. He said he knew someone was home because he could see the television light flickering through the window. He said he really needed to check that meter, that it was important, that there could be a fire hazard if he did not inspect it today. His voice had an edge to it now, something sharp underneath the polite words. I wanted to yell that my mom would be home any second, but my throat felt like it had closed up completely. The knocking became pounding, 5 or 6 heavy blows that shook the whole door, and then suddenly it stopped. Complete silence. I counted to 30 in my head, then to 60, waiting for something else to happen. I thought maybe he had given up and left. I was about to peek through the curtain gap again when I heard footsteps, but they were not going away from the house, they were going around it. The footsteps crunched on the gravel path that ran along the side of our house, the path that led to the backyard, to the back door. My bedroom was at the back of the house, and so was the kitchen, and the back door had this old lock that Mom always complained about, saying she needed to get it replaced because it was flimsy and loose. I heard the footsteps stop. Then I heard the back doorknob rattle, a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the quiet house. Pumpkin hissed, actually hissed, something I had never heard him do in the 4 years we had owned him. The rattling stopped for a moment, and I let myself hope that the lock had held, that he would go away now. That hope died when I heard a heavy thud against the back door, then another, then a third one that made the whole frame groan. He was throwing his shoulder against it, trying to break it down. I ran. I did not think about it, did not plan it. My legs just moved on their own. I sprinted down the hallway to my bedroom and dove into my closet, pulling the door shut behind me and burying myself under a pile of dirty laundry and old stuffed animals. The closet smelled like dust and the strawberry shampoo from my unwashed clothes, and I pressed both hands over my mouth to keep from making any sound. Through the thin walls, I heard a loud crack, the unmistakable sound of wood splintering, and then a heavy thump as the back door swung open and hit the kitchen wall. He was inside. I heard his boots on the linoleum, slow and deliberate, not rushing at all, like he had all the time in the world. I heard him open a cabinet, then another, the hinges squeaking in that familiar way I had heard 1,000 times when Mom made dinner. Then came a sound that made my whole body go cold. A long metallic scrape, the sound of something being dragged across the counter. I knew exactly what that sound was because I had heard it every time Mom pulled a knife from the wooden block next to the stove. He had taken a knife from our kitchen. The footsteps left the linoleum and moved onto carpet, which meant he was in the living room now. I heard him pause, probably looking around, and then the footsteps resumed, heading down the hallway toward the bedrooms. Toward me. I squeezed my eyes shut so tight that colors exploded behind my eyelids, and I prayed harder than I had ever prayed in my entire life. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I could hear him breathing, heavy and slow, and I could see his shadow through the crack at the bottom of the closet door, a dark shape blocking the light from the hallway. The bedroom door creaked open. I heard him step inside, heard the floorboard by my dresser groan under his weight, the same floorboard that always woke Mom up when she came to check on me at night. He was maybe 10 feet away from where I was hiding, separated only by a closet door and a pile of laundry. I bit down on my own hand to keep from screaming, tasted blood on my tongue, and waited for the closet door to open. Then a car door slammed outside. The sound was distant but unmistakable, and I heard the man freeze, his breathing stopping for a second. Another sound followed, the beep of a car being locked, and then footsteps on the front porch, quick and hurried. Mom. She was back early. I heard her keys jangling as she searched for the right one, and the man in my room moved fast, his boots thumping against the carpet as he left, heading back down the hallway toward the kitchen. I heard the back door bang against the wall again as he ran through it, heard his footsteps pounding across the backyard, getting fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. The front door opened and Mom called my name, her voice normal at first, almost cheerful, saying that Grandma was okay and it was just a minor bruise. Then her voice changed. She had seen something, maybe the back door hanging open or the mess in the kitchen, and she screamed my name in a way I had never heard before, pure terror and desperation. I burst out of the closet and ran to her, crashing into her arms so hard that we both almost fell over, and I started crying. These huge, ugly sobs that I could not control no matter how hard I tried. Mom held me tight and kept asking what happened, but I could barely get the words out between sobs. She walked through the house with me clinging to her side, and I watched her face go pale as she took in the details. The back door was hanging off one hinge, the frame cracked and splintered where the lock had given way. There were muddy footprints on the kitchen floor, large boot prints that tracked across the linoleum and onto the living room carpet, making a path through our home like a violation written in dirt. The wooden knife block on the counter had an empty slot where the biggest knife should have been, the 8-inch chef knife that Mom used to cut vegetables for dinner. She checked the living room window and found it unlocked. The latch turned to the open position, which meant he had planned an alternate escape route before he even broke in. That detail scared her more than anything else, she told me later. It meant he had thought this through, had walked around our house and tested the windows, had made a plan. The police arrived within 15 minutes of Mom calling them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both of them taking notes while I sat on the couch wrapped in my green blanket with pumpkin pressed against my chest. I told them everything I could remember: the dark green jacket, the gray baseball cap with no logo, the clipboard he had been holding, the way his voice changed from friendly to threatening. They took photographs of the footprints, dusted the doorknobs and window latch for fingerprints, and bagged the broken pieces of the door frame as evidence. One of the officers told Mom that there had been 2 other break-ins in neighborhoods nearby over the past month. Same method, someone posing as a utility worker and targeting houses during the day when most people were at work. They never caught him. Months went by, then years, and they never found out who he was or where he went. The detective assigned to our case called a few times in the beginning. Then the calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. The file is probably sitting in a box somewhere, unsolved, just another statistic. We moved out of that house 3 weeks later. Mom found an apartment in a bigger complex with security cameras and a doorman, and she had a deadbolt installed that was so heavy it took both hands to turn. She also signed me up for self-defense classes and bought a baseball bat that she kept beside her bed for years. I am 20 now, a junior in college studying psychology, and I still check every lock twice before I go to sleep. I still look through the peephole whenever someone knocks, even if I am expecting a package. And sometimes, when the house gets too quiet, I hear those slow, deliberate footsteps on linoleum, and I feel that knife-shaped absence in my chest, that empty slot where safety used to be. We never found out what he wanted, whether it was robbery or something worse, and maybe that is the part that still haunts me most. Not knowing. The not knowing is its own kind of scar, the kind that never fully heals, just fades enough that you can pretend it is not there until something reminds you. A knock on the door, a stranger in a cap, the sound of boots on a hard floor. Then it all comes back fresh as the day it happened, and I am 10 years old again, hiding in a closet, biting my hand to keep from screaming. Lily had just turned 6 the week before, and she had been begging me for days to take her to see the new dolls at Brennan's, this big department store, about 20 minutes from our apartment in Wilmington. It was a Saturday afternoon in April 2017, one of those bright spring days where the sun made everything feel safe and normal. I had just wrapped up a long week managing inventory at a warehouse distribution center. The kind of job where you spend most of your time staring at spreadsheets and wondering how you ended up there after college. My husband was out of town visiting his mother in Virginia, so it was just me and Lily for the weekend. She was wearing her favorite purple jacket, the one with the little butterfly patches she had picked out herself, and her hair was in two messy pigtails because I never could get them as neat as my mom used to do mine. We walked into that store holding hands, and I remember thinking how much I loved these small moments with her, just the two of us on a simple Saturday errand. Brennan's was crowded that day, packed with families doing their weekend shopping, and the toy section sat in the back corner of the second floor. We took the escalator up, Lily bouncing with excitement the whole ride, her little fingers gripping the rubber handrail. The store had this particular layout, where the toy aisles formed a maze of bright colors and cardboard displays, and the doll section was right next to a wall of stuffed animals that stretched from floor to ceiling. I parked our cart at the end of the aisle and told Lily she could walk ahead to look at the dolls while I checked my phone for a message from my husband. She skipped forward maybe 10 feet, still completely within my sight, her purple jacket like a beacon among the pastel packaging. I glanced down at my phone for what felt like 3 seconds, maybe 5 at most. When I looked up, a woman I had never seen before had her hand wrapped around my daughter's wrist and was pulling her toward the opposite end of the aisle. The woman was maybe in her late 40s, with short auburn hair that looked freshly dyed and a beige cardigan over a floral blouse. She looked like someone's aunt, like someone you might see at a PTA meeting or a church potluck. That was the thing that made everything feel so surreal in those first seconds. She did not look threatening at all. She was leaning down toward Lily with this calm, patient expression, the kind of face adults make when they are trying to reason with a fussy child. Lily was pulling back, her little sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, and I could see the confusion on her face turning into fear. I dropped my phone. I think it hit the floor, but I did not hear it, and I started moving toward them. Everything felt like it was happening underwater, too slow and too fast at the same time, and I remember my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The woman saw me coming, and her expression did not change at all, which was somehow worse than if she had looked panicked or guilty. She tightened her grip on Lily's wrist and started walking faster, saying something to my daughter in this low, even voice. I was close enough now to hear the words, and they made my whole body go cold. She was saying, "Come on, sweetie, your mom is waiting for us by the car. Do not make a scene, okay? Do not make a scene." Lily looked back at me with these wide, terrified eyes, and she opened her mouth and screamed the word "mommy" so loud that people 3 aisles over must have heard it. The woman flinched but did not let go, and I closed the distance between us in what felt like 2 steps, grabbing Lily's other arm and yanking her toward me with every ounce of strength I had. For a moment we were locked in this horrible tug of war, my daughter between us like a rag doll, and I remember screaming something at the woman, but I have no idea what words came out of my mouth. It was pure animal instinct, nothing coherent, just raw noise and fury. The woman finally let go so suddenly that Lily and I stumbled backward into a display of board games that crashed to the floor around us. I pulled Lily into my chest and wrapped both arms around her, feeling her small body shaking against mine, her face pressed into my neck. The woman stood there for maybe 2 seconds, staring at us with this blank expression that I still see sometimes when I close my eyes at night. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the back of the store, not running but moving with purpose, like she had somewhere specific to be. A store employee appeared at the end of the aisle, a young guy with a red vest and a confused look on his face, asking if everything was okay. I could barely get the words out. I kept pointing toward where the woman had gone, trying to explain that she had just tried to take my daughter, but my voice was coming out in these broken gasps that did not sound like language. Lily was crying into my shoulder, repeating, she grabbed me," over and over, and other shoppers were starting to gather around us with their phones out. The employee radioed for security, and within a minute there were 2 guards standing with us, a man and a woman, both of them asking me to describe what happened. I gave them every detail I could remember about the woman, her hair color, her cardigan, the floral pattern on her blouse, her calm voice that still echoed in my head. The female guard asked me to come with her to the security office on the 1st floor, and I carried Lily the whole way because I could not stand to let her walk beside me, could not risk having even a foot of distance between us. The security office was a small, windowless room behind the customer service desk, crammed with monitors showing grainy footage from cameras all over the store. The head of security was a heavy-set man named Ron with a gray mustache and kind eyes that made me feel like maybe everything was going to be okay. He sat me down in a plastic chair and handed me a bottle of water while his colleague started rewinding through the footage. Lily had stopped crying, but she would not let go of my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeve like she thought I might disappear. I watched the monitors as they scrolled backward through time, seeing myself and Lily arrive at the toy section, seeing the woman approach from somewhere off-screen. Ron asked me to walk him through what happened while they searched for the moment when the woman entered the store. I told him everything, every detail I could remember, and he wrote it all down in a little notebook with handwriting so neat it looked like a font. They found her on the footage entering through the main doors about 15 minutes before she grabbed Lily. She walked in alone, browsed through the women's clothing section for a few minutes, then made her way upstairs to toys. Ron zoomed in on her face and printed a still image, her features pixelated but recognizable, that same calm expression she had worn while trying to drag my daughter away. But then he showed me something that made the room feel like it was tilting sideways. He pulled up footage from a camera near the loading dock at the back of the store, time-stamped just 2 minutes after the woman had let go of Lily's arm. There she was, walking quickly through a door marked "Employees Only," and waiting for her in the loading area were 2 men. One was tall and thin with a shaved head, wearing a dark jacket despite the warm weather. The other was shorter, stockier, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. They were standing next to a white van with no windows in the back, the engine already running. Ron paused the footage and looked at me with an expression that confirmed everything I was already feeling. This was not some confused woman who thought Lily was her niece. This was planned, coordinated, a trap that my daughter had walked right into while I stood 10 feet away checking my phone. The woman climbed into the back of the van, and one of the men slid the door shut behind her. The van pulled out of the loading area and disappeared from the camera's view within seconds. Ron told me the police were already on their way, that they would want to see all of this footage and talk to me about what happened. I nodded, but I was not really listening anymore. I was doing the math in my head, calculating how close we had come to a completely different ending. If Lily had not screamed, if I had looked at my phone for 10 seconds instead of 5, if the woman had been just a little bit faster or a little bit stronger. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers in uniform and a detective in plain clothes who introduced herself as Nora Castillo. She had a calm, no-nonsense way about her that reminded me of my older sister, the way she asked questions without ever making me feel like I was being interrogated. I went through the whole story again, start to finish, while she took notes on a tablet. Lily had fallen asleep on my lap by then, exhausted from crying, her thumb in her mouth like she had not done since she was 3. Detective Castillo watched the security footage twice, pausing it in different places, zooming in on the faces of the 2 men by the van. She told me that this fit a pattern they had been tracking for months: organized groups who targeted children in public places, using women as the primary approach because they were less likely to trigger alarm. She said the phrase, "do not make a scene," was something they trained their people to say, a way of making it look like a family dispute rather than an abduction. They never caught them. Detective Castillo called me a few times over the following weeks, updating me on the investigation, but the van's plates had been stolen from a car in Delaware, and the footage was not clear enough to run through facial recognition. She told me that groups like this moved constantly, hitting different stores in different cities, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. The woman who grabbed Lily could be anywhere by now, could be approaching another child in another toy aisle at this very moment. That thought kept me awake for months, still keeps me awake sometimes. I think about the other parents who were not as lucky as me, the ones who looked at their phones for 10 seconds instead of 5, the ones whose children did not know to scream. I think about what would have happened if that van had pulled away with my daughter inside, where she would have ended up, what they would have done to her. Those thoughts never fully go away. They just get quieter over time. Lily is 14 now, and she still will not let me out of her sight in public places. She does not remember the details of that day anymore. The memories have faded into something vague and dreamlike. But her body remembers. She gets anxious in crowds, reaches for my hand without thinking about it, always positions herself so she can see the exits. We never went back to Brennan's. It closed down a few years later anyway. But every time we pass a department store, she walks a little faster. I taught her everything Detective Castillo told me to teach her. How to scream and fight and never stop making noise. How to yell, "This is not my mom," or "I do not know this person," so bystanders understand what is happening. I check her location on my phone a dozen times a day, even though she is too old for that now. Even though she rolls her eyes every time I text to ask where she is. I know I am overprotective. I know I need to let her grow up. But I keep seeing that woman's calm face. Keep hearing those words in that steady voice. Do not make a scene. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and Lily is safe in her room and the house is locked up tight, I let myself feel the full weight of how close we came. And then I get up and check the locks one more time, just to be sure. Every Friday afternoon, right after the school bus dropped me off, my mom would already have my overnight bag packed and waiting by the front door. She and my dad worked double shifts at the textile factory on the edge of town, and weekends meant I stayed at Uncle Vernon's place, a crooked two-story house on Granger Road in Wilmington, North Carolina. Born in 1989, I was 9 years old during the spring of 1998, when everything changed. Vernon was my dad's younger brother, a quiet man with deep-set eyes and hands that always seemed too still. He worked from home doing something with computers, though I never understood exactly what. His house smelled like pine sol and something else underneath, something metallic that I could never quite place. He kept the curtains drawn even during the day, and the only sounds were the hum of his equipment and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Uncle Vernon had 3 rules that he repeated every single time I walked through his door. First, I could eat anything in the fridge except the items on the bottom shelf. Second, bedtime was 9 o'clock sharp, no exceptions. Third, and he always said this one slower, leaning down to meet my eyes, I was never under any circumstances to open the basement door. He told me the stairs were rotted through and dangerous, that he kept old electrical equipment down there that could hurt me. The door itself was nothing special, just a plain white door at the end of the hallway near the kitchen. But it had 3 heavy-duty locks on it, deadbolts, the kind you see on front doors of apartments in bad neighborhoods. Even at 9 years old, I remember thinking that was strange. You do not put 3 deadbolts on a door just to protect a kid from falling down some stairs. But I was a quiet child, obedient to a fault, and Uncle Vernon was always kind to me in his distant way. He let me watch cartoons, made me grilled cheese sandwiches, and never raised his voice. So I followed his rules without question, and I never touched that door. That particular weekend started like any other. My dad dropped me off around 6 in the evening, gave me a quick hug through the car window, and drove off with a tired wave. Uncle Vernon stood on the porch wearing his usual outfit, khaki pants, a faded blue button-down shirt, and those thick glasses that made his eyes look smaller than they were. He smiled when he saw me, but his smiles never quite reached his eyes. They were more like a reflex, something he had learned to do rather than something he felt. We ate dinner together in the kitchen, microwaved lasagna and a glass of milk, while he asked me about school in that flat, distracted way of his. I told him about my spelling test and the new kid in class named Oliver who ate glue. Vernon nodded at all the right moments, but I could tell his mind was somewhere else. He kept glancing at his watch, then toward the hallway where the basement door waited in shadow. After dinner, I settled into my usual spot on the living room couch with a blanket and the remote control. Vernon had basic cable, which meant I could watch Cartoon Network until 9 o'clock. He disappeared into his office down the hall, a small room packed with computer towers and tangled wires, and I heard the familiar click of his door closing. That was normal. He always worked at night, typing away at something I was never allowed to see. Around 8:30, I heard his office door open, followed by his footsteps moving through the house. But instead of coming to check on me, the footsteps went the other direction, toward the kitchen, toward the basement. I heard the metallic scrape of locks being turned, one after another, then the creak of a door opening, then footsteps descending stairs that were supposedly too dangerous for anyone to use. I turned the volume up on the television and pretended I had not noticed. That was what good boys did. They minded their own business and followed the rules. 9 o'clock came and Vernon reappeared from somewhere in the back of the house, his face calm and expressionless as always. He told me it was bedtime, and I did not argue. The guest room was on the second floor, a small space with yellow wallpaper and a twin bed that squeaked every time I moved. There was a window that looked out onto the backyard, but Vernon kept it locked and covered with thick curtains. He tucked me in the way he always did, mechanical, efficient, like he was following instructions from a manual. He said goodnight, turned off the lamp, and closed the door behind him. I lay there in the dark, listening to the old house settle around me. The pipes groaned, the walls creaked, and somewhere beneath me, through the floorboards and the ceiling of the first floor and whatever lay below that, I heard something else. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A voice, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. Someone was crying. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and squeezed my eyes shut. It is just the pipes, I told myself. Old houses make weird noises. That is what my dad always said when our own house creaked at night. But the sound continued, rising and falling in a rhythm that pipes do not make. It was a person, a young person, maybe a teenager, sobbing in short, hitching breaths like they were trying to stay quiet but could not help themselves. My heart pounded against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to call out for Uncle Vernon, but something stopped me. Some instinct buried deep in my 9-year-old brain that whispered, "Do not let him know you heard." I do not know how long I lay there, rigid under the covers, listening to that awful sound. It could have been minutes. It could have been an hour. Eventually, the crying stopped. The house went silent. And somehow, despite everything, I fell into a thin, restless sleep filled with dreams I could not remember when I woke. A noise jolted me awake sometime in the middle of the night. The room was pitch black, and for a moment I could not remember where I was. Then it came back to me. Uncle Vernon's house, the guest room, the crying from below. I held my breath and listened. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps on the first floor, directly beneath my room. Then a different sound, something being dragged across the hardwood. It was a scraping, stuttering noise, like something heavy and unwilling being pulled along the floor. I heard the basement door creak open. I heard Uncle Vernon's voice, low and calm, saying words I could not make out. And then I heard another voice, a younger voice, male, pleading in broken, desperate tones. The words were muffled through the floor, but the terror in them was unmistakable. "Please, and stop, and I want to go home." My whole body went cold. I was 9 years old and I did not fully understand what I was hearing, but I knew in some primal animal way that something very bad was happening in this house. I should have stayed in bed. I should have pulled the covers over my head and waited for morning. That is what I tell myself now, decades later, when the memories come back in the middle of the night. But I was a child, and children are curious even when they are afraid, maybe especially when they are afraid. I slipped out from under the blanket and crept toward the bedroom door, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The door was old and heavy, and I opened it just a crack, just enough to see the staircase leading down to the first floor. The hallway below was dim, lit only by a faint glow coming from the direction of the kitchen. I could hear Uncle Vernon's voice more clearly now, that same calm, measured tone he used when he told me the rules. And I could hear the other voice too, the young one, no longer pleading but whimpering softly like an injured animal. Every instinct screamed at me to go back to bed, but my feet carried me forward anyway. I crept down the stairs one at a time, my hand gripping the railing so tight my knuckles ached. At the bottom of the stairs, I pressed myself against the wall and peered around the corner toward the kitchen. The basement door stood wide open, spilling a sickly yellow light into the hallway. And there was Uncle Vernon, his back to me, dragging someone, through that forbidden doorway. The teenager was maybe 15 or 16, with shaggy brown hair matted with sweat and dirt. His wrists were bound behind his back with gray duct tape, and there was more tape wrapped around his mouth, muffling his cries into pathetic nasal moans. His eyes were wide and red-rimmed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He was wearing a torn green jacket and jeans that were filthy, like he had been wearing them for days, maybe weeks. Vernon pulled him by the collar with one hand, completely unbothered by the boy's thrashing, like he was hauling a bag of garbage to the curb. I stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe, watching my uncle drag a bound and beaten teenager into the basement like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Then Vernon stopped, his head tilted slightly, like a dog hearing a distant whistle. He turned around slowly, and his eyes found me standing at the bottom of the stairs in my pajamas. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The teenager on the ground went still too, his muffled cries cutting off abruptly as he followed Vernon's gaze and saw me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something in them that I will never forget. A desperate, flickering hope, like he thought maybe I could save him. Then Vernon smiled. It was not the mechanical smile I was used to. This one was different. Warmer, almost. Like he was genuinely pleased to see me. He released the teenager's collar and straightened up, brushing off his hands on his khaki pants. "Hey, buddy," he said in that same calm voice. "Go back to bed. You did not see anything." He said it like he was reminding me to brush my teeth. Casual, friendly, like we were having a perfectly normal conversation in the middle of a perfectly normal night. I ran. I do not remember making the decision to run. My body just moved on its own, turning and scrambling back up the stairs on all fours like a frightened animal. I heard Vernon call after me, still calm, still friendly. "It is okay, buddy. Everything is okay. Just go back to sleep." I did not stop. I burst into the guest room and dove under the covers, pulling the blanket over my head and curling into the tightest ball I could manage. My chest heaved. My whole body trembled. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my palms over my ears, trying to block out the world, trying to pretend I was somewhere else, anywhere else. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, unhurried. Then they stopped outside my door. The handle turned. The door creaked open. I felt Vernon's presence in the room, standing there in the darkness, watching me. Neither of us spoke. After what felt like an eternity, the door clicked shut again. The footsteps retreated down the stairs. And I lay there, shaking, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the curtains. When morning came, Vernon acted like nothing had happened. He made me scrambled eggs and toast, humming softly to himself while he cooked. The basement door was closed and locked, all 3 deadbolts firmly in place. The hallway floor was spotless. No scuff marks, no dirt, no sign that anyone had been dragged across it just hours before. Vernon asked me if I slept well, and I nodded because I did not trust my voice. He smiled that mechanical smile and told me my dad would be picking me up around noon. I sat at the kitchen table and ate my eggs in silence, my eyes fixed on my plate, terrified to look anywhere else. The house smelled like pine sol again, stronger than usual, like Vernon had been cleaning all night. When my dad arrived, I ran to the car without looking back. I climbed into the back seat and stared out the window as we drove away, watching Uncle Vernon wave from the porch, his hand moving slowly back and forth like a metronome. I never told my parents what I saw. I was 9 years old, and I did not have the words. And part of me, a bigger part than I want to admit, was afraid that if I said anything, Vernon would know. Vernon would find out. Vernon would come for me. After that weekend, I refused to go back to Uncle Vernon's house. I threw tantrums, faked sickness, did everything a 9-year-old could do to avoid being left there again. My parents thought I was just being difficult, going through a phase, my mom called it. They tried to force the issue a few times, but I screamed and cried so hard that eventually they gave up and found a neighbor lady to watch me instead. Vernon came to our house for Thanksgiving that year, and I locked myself in my room and refused to come out until he left. My dad was furious with me, said I was being disrespectful to family. I took the punishment, no television for a week, without complaint. It was worth it. Anything was worth it to never be alone with Vernon again. Over the years, I saw him less and less. He moved away when I was 12 somewhere out west, and the family lost touch. I grew up, went to college, got a job, built a life. I buried that night so deep I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Almost. Then, 15 years later, I saw his face on the evening news. Vernon Caldwell, 53 years old, arrested in Albuquerque, New Mexico for the kidnapping and imprisonment of 2 teenage boys. The police had found them in a soundproofed room beneath his garage, malnourished and terrified, but alive. The news anchor said Vernon had been linked to at least 4 other missing persons cases across 3 states, dating back over 2 decades. They showed his mugshot, older now, grayer, but with those same deep-set eyes and that same flat expression. I sat on my couch and stared at the screen, and suddenly I was 9 years old again, standing at the bottom of those stairs, watching my uncle drag a bound teenager into the darkness. I thought about the boy in the green jacket, the one whose eyes had begged me for help. I never found out what happened to him. I looked through every article, every court document I could find, but his name was never mentioned. Maybe he escaped. Maybe Vernon let him go. Or maybe he is still down there somewhere, in a basement I never had the courage to report, buried beneath a house that was torn down years ago. I will never know. And I think that is the part that haunts me most, not what I saw, but what I did not do. I was just a kid. I know that. But some nights when the house is quiet and the memories come flooding back, I still hear that muffled crying through the floorboards. And I wonder if things might have been different, if I had just found the words to speak. Seventh grade was the year I learned what real fear feels like. Not the kind you get from horror movies or haunted houses at the fair, but the deep, paralyzing kind that starts in your chest and spreads through your whole body until you cannot breathe. It was a Friday in March 2014, and I had been running a fever all night, so my mom finally let me stay home from school. We lived in a quiet suburb outside of Baltimore, on a street called Ashford Circle where nothing interesting ever happened. My dad worked as an accountant and left the house around 6 every morning. My mom was a nurse at a hospital 20 minutes away, and her shift started at 7:30. Before she left, she stuck a yellow note on the refrigerator with her neat handwriting. "Take your medicine at noon, drink fluids. Do not answer the door for anyone. Call me if anything happens." I barely glanced at it. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where people left their cars unlocked, and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. The idea that something bad could happen there seemed almost ridiculous. The morning went by slowly, the way sick days always do. I watched cartoons for a while, then switched to some action movie on cable that I had already seen twice before. My throat hurt and my head felt stuffed with cotton, but it was manageable. My older sister Natalie was away at college in Virginia, so I had the whole house to myself, which felt like a rare kind of freedom. Around 11, I heated up leftover chicken soup and ate it on the living room couch, something my mom never allowed when she was home. Outside, the sky was a flat, heavy gray, the kind that makes everything feel muted and still. I looked out the front window at some point and noticed how empty the street was. All the neighbors were at work, all the kids at school. The only movement was a single crow hopping across the Delgado family lawn 3 houses down. For the first time that morning, the silence in the house started to feel less comfortable and more like something pressing against my ears. It was around 12:30 when I first heard it. I had just taken my medicine and was walking back to the couch when there was a sound at the front door. Not a knock exactly, but more like someone testing the handle, turning it slowly back and forth. My first thought was that maybe my mom had come home early to check on me, but that did not make sense because she always used the garage door. I stood in the hallway, frozen mid-step, and listened. The handle moved again, a soft metallic rattling that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet house. Then it stopped. I figured it was probably a delivery driver who got confused when no one answered, maybe leaving a package on the porch. We got stuff from online orders all the time. I almost walked to the door to check, but something made me hesitate. Instead, I stayed where I was and waited. About 30 seconds later, I heard footsteps moving along the side of the house, crunching softly on the dead leaves that had piled up against the foundation over the winter. They were heading toward the back. Told myself it was nothing. Maybe a meter reader from the electric company, or a neighbor looking for their dog. There were 100 explanations that made sense, and I cycled through all of them as I stood there in my pajamas with my heart beating just a little faster than normal. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the back of the house, and then I heard a new sound, a soft tapping on glass. It was coming from the kitchen window, the one above the sink that looked out onto our small backyard. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone testing how solid it was. I crept toward the kitchen doorway and peered around the corner, but from that angle I could not see the window properly. The tapping stopped, and for a moment everything was quiet again. Then the footsteps resumed, moving further along the back of the house toward my parents' bedroom on the other side. I heard another window being tested, this one with more force, a pushing and rattling sound that made my stomach tighten into a hard knot. I should have called my mom right then. I should have called 911, but my 12-year-old brain was still trying to convince itself that this was normal, that there was some reasonable explanation I just was not seeing. Maybe it was a maintenance worker my parents had scheduled and forgotten to tell me about. Maybe it was someone from the homeowners association checking something on the exterior. I stood in the hallway, barely breathing, and listened as the footsteps circled back toward the front of the house. For a few seconds, I thought whoever it was had given up and left. The silence stretched out, and I started to relax just a little, letting out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. Then I heard a new sound coming from the living room, a slow, deliberate scraping noise that made every hair on my arm stand up. It was metal against metal, a grinding and prying sound that I could not immediately identify. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move toward the living room entrance, staying close to the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. What I saw when I peeked around the corner is something I will never forget as long as I live. There was a man crouched outside the large window that faced our front yard, the one with the broken lock my dad had been meaning to fix for months. He was using a flathead screwdriver to pry at the window frame, working it back and forth with practiced movements like he had done this 100 times before. The man looked like he was in his 40s, with thinning brown hair and a red jacket that had some kind of logo on the chest I could not make out. His face was completely calm, focused, like he was just doing a regular job. Not rushed, not nervous, just methodical. I pulled back from the doorway so fast I almost tripped over my own feet. My heart was slamming against my ribs now, and I could feel the fever sweat mixing with a cold, different kind of sweat that was breaking out all over my body. This was not a delivery driver. This was not a maintenance worker. Someone was breaking into my house, and I was the only one home. I moved without thinking, pure instinct taking over. There was a hallway closet about 10 feet from where I stood, the one where we kept winter coats and old board games and boxes of stuff we never used. I opened the door as quietly as I could, slipped inside and pulled it shut behind me, leaving it open just a crack so it would not make that clicking sound. The closet was dark and smelled like mothballs and dust. I pressed myself into the far corner, behind a thick wool coat that had belonged to my grandfather before he died, and I pulled out my phone. My fingers were trembling so badly that I almost dropped it twice. I could not call 911 because I was terrified that I would have to speak, and if I spoke, he would hear me. So I called my mom instead and pressed the phone to my ear, praying she would pick up. It rang 4 times, and each ring felt like an eternity. I heard a loud cracking sound from the living room, the sound of wood splintering, and I knew he was inside. My mom answered just as I heard the window sliding open, and I whispered so quietly I was not even sure she could hear me. "Mom, there is a man in the house." The next few minutes were the longest of my entire life. My mom kept her voice calm even though I could hear the panic underneath it, and she told me to stay exactly where I was. Do not move, do not make any sound. She was calling 911 on the office phone right now. I heard the man step through the window and land on our living room floor with a soft thud. His footsteps were slow and deliberate on the hardwood, moving through the room like he had all the time in the world. Then he started talking, and that was the part that made me want to scream. His voice was casual, almost friendly, like he was calling out to a neighbor. "I know someone is home," he said. "I saw you through the window earlier. Just come out and we can talk. No reason to hide." The closet suddenly felt like the worst hiding spot in the world. It was so obvious, so predictable. I pressed my hand over my mouth and tried to control my breathing, but my whole body was shaking. My mom was whispering in my ear, telling me the police were on their way, telling me to stay quiet, telling me I was going to be okay. I wanted to believe her, but I could hear the man walking down the hallway now, opening doors one by one. He checked the bathroom first. I heard the shower curtain being pulled back, the metal rings scraping against the rod. Then he moved to my sister Natalie's old room, and I heard him open her closet, push some things around, close it again. "Come on, buddy," he called out, his voice getting closer. "I am not going to hurt you. I just want to talk. Your parents are not here. It is just us." There was something in the way he said it that made my skin go cold, a kind of practiced reassurance that felt rehearsed, like lines from a script he had used before. My mom was still on the phone, and I could hear her crying now, telling me she loved me, telling me to hold on. The police were almost there. The man's footsteps stopped right outside the hallway closet. I could see the shadow of his feet through the crack at the bottom of the door, two dark shapes blocking the thin strip of light. My lungs were burning because I had been holding my breath without realizing it. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed myself deeper into the corner, behind the coats, making myself as small as humanly possible. I heard him put his hand on the doorknob. I heard it start to turn. And then, like some kind of miracle, the sirens came. They were distant at first, just a faint wailing sound somewhere in the neighborhood, but they got louder fast. The man stopped turning the knob. I heard him mutter something under his breath, a single word I could not make out. The shadow of his feet disappeared from under the door, and his footsteps moved quickly back down the hallway toward the living room. I heard him climb back through the window, heard his feet hit the ground outside, and then nothing. Just the sirens getting closer and closer until they seemed to be right outside our house. I stayed in that closet. I did not move. Even when I heard car doors slamming and voices shouting and someone pounding on our front door announcing they were police, I could not make my body respond. My mom was screaming my name through the phone now, asking if I was okay, begging me to answer. I finally managed to whisper, "He is gone," and then I started crying so hard I could barely breathe. The police had to coax me out of that closet. One of them, a woman with short gray hair and kind eyes, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and told me I did everything right, that I was so brave. I did not feel brave. I felt like I was going to throw up. My mom made it home in 15 minutes, a drive that usually took her at least 25. She ran through the front door and grabbed me so hard I thought she might crack my ribs, and she did not let go for a long time. My dad came home from work right after, his face pale and his tie loosened like he had been pulling at it the whole drive. The police asked me questions for what felt like hours, and I told them everything I could remember. The red jacket, the thinning hair, the screwdriver, the way he talked like we were old friends. They dusted for fingerprints and took photographs of the damaged window frame. A detective named Rourke, a tall man with a thick mustache and a voice like gravel, told my parents they would do everything they could to find the guy. But it was what they found on our security cameras that really changed everything. My dad had installed a basic system the year before, just 2 cameras covering the driveway and the front porch. When the police reviewed the footage, they did not just find the break-in. They found weeks of recordings showing the same man in the red jacket walking past our house, sometimes slowly, sometimes stopping to look. He appeared on camera 14 different times over the span of 3 weeks, always during school hours, always when both cars were gone from the driveway. He had been watching us. He had been waiting. They caught him 6 days later. His name was Ronald Weber, 44 years old, and he lived in an apartment complex about 8 miles from our neighborhood. He had 2 prior convictions for burglary and 1 for assault. The police told my parents that guys like him specifically target houses where they think only children are home, because kids are less likely to fight back and more likely to hide. He had apparently done this before in other neighborhoods, other towns, always picking sick days or half days when a child might be alone. I do not know what he would have done if those sirens had come 30 seconds later, if his hand had finished turning that doorknob. I try not to think about it, but sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, my mind goes there anyway. We moved to a different house the following summer, one with a better security system and stronger locks and no windows that a screwdriver could pry open. I am 23 now, finishing up graduate school in Boston, and I still check every lock twice before I go to bed. I still feel my chest tighten when I hear unexpected footsteps outside. Some fears do not go away just because you survive them. They just become part of who you are. Back when I was a kid, my world revolved around the little playground a few blocks from home. My mom worked double shifts most days, so my older brother, Mark, was usually the one keeping an eye on me, even though he was only 12 at the time. I remember that afternoon being warm enough for the metal slide to sting the backs of my legs, and the air had that dusty smell the park always got when groups of kids had been running around for hours. I'd been trying to braid dandelion stems into a crown, something I'd seen older girls do, when a man I recognized from the community center walked by the swings and called my name like he already knew me. He was the type of person adults seem to trust without thinking twice. Everyone knew he helped with weekend events, handing out snacks and picking up trash with a pair of rubber gloves he kept tucked into his back pocket. He had this habit of leaning forward when he talked, like he genuinely wanted to hear every word you said. I remember noticing his watch that day. Thick leather band, scratched face, one of the numbers missing. For some reason I thought it looked important, the kind of thing grown-ups wore when they had someplace serious to be. He asked where Mark was, and I told him my brother had gone a few streets over with his friends, promising he'd be back in a little while. The man nodded like this was completely expected, and then said he needed help with something important for the center. I didn't understand much at that age, just that adults liked when kids helped out, and I always wanted to be one of the helpful ones. He mentioned a small storeroom behind the park where they kept supplies for the weekend activities. Chalk, signs, old folding chairs. I remember feeling oddly proud that he'd asked me specifically, like I'd been trusted with some kind of little mission. When we reached the back of the park, I noticed the door blended into the walls so well it looked almost hidden. He unlocked it with a key he kept on a long cord around his neck, and I followed him inside without thinking. The room smelled like old cardboard and warm plastic, and there was a single bulb buzzing above us, flickering just enough to make the shadows shift on the floor. Before I could even ask what he needed help with, the door clicked behind me, and he turned the lock with a movement so casual it didn't register as wrong until he positioned himself between me and the way out. The shift in his behavior was subtle, but even at 6, I could tell something wasn't right. He started talking in this slow, drawn-out way, asking if anyone ever told me how grown up I seemed. I remember staring at the floor, tracing the shape of a dent in the concrete with my shoe, because looking at him suddenly felt uncomfortable. He moved closer, not touching me, but close enough that the air felt too crowded for such a small room. His voice dropped lower, almost like he didn't want anyone outside to hear, and he kept making comments that didn't sound like the things adults usually said to kids. The bulb above us flickered again, and without warning, He rested his hand on the metal shelf beside me, trapping me between the crates and his arm. I didn't understand the meaning behind his gestures, but I knew I didn't like it. He asked if I wanted to see something special he'd set aside just for me. And the way he said it made me step back until my shoulders touched the cold wall. He watched me with this strange, fixed expression, like he wasn't seeing me as a person anymore, but something else he thought he had control over. Before he could say anything else, there was a sudden echo of footsteps outside, fast, uneven, and getting closer. Then Mark's voice broke through the silence, sharper than I'd ever heard it. He was calling my name over and over, and behind him I heard the voices of his friends, all of them sounding out of breath and angry. They must have realized I'd wandered off longer than usual, because the next thing I remember is the sound of fists hitting the door, not just knocking but slamming hard enough to rattle the hinges. The man jerked backward like someone had yanked a string attached to his spine. His face went pale, and he whispered something under his breath before fumbling with the lock. The pounding outside only got louder, echoing through the small space, and for a moment I honestly thought the door might break open. When he finally twisted the key, he pulled the door open just a crack and muttered for me to go quickly, like he knew there was no way to talk his way out of what was happening. I slipped past him, my legs stiff and shaky, and ran straight into Mark's arms. Mark didn't let go of me right away. He kept one arm around my shoulders while grilling the man with questions, demanding to know why I'd been in there with him and why the door was locked. His friend stood behind him, tense and ready to jump in if anything happened. The man tried to act calm, adjusting the cord of his key and insisting it was a misunderstanding, that he'd only been showing me where they kept supplies. But his voice shook just enough for even a kid to notice, and he wouldn't look any of them directly in the eye. One of Mark's friends, Tyler, pointed out that adults didn't usually give private tours to little kids in rooms with no windows. Another said he'd seen us walk toward the back of the park and thought it was weird. The man stepped away from the door as if putting distance between us would somehow erase what he'd done. I remember staring at the ground, too overwhelmed to process anything except the relief of being outside that room again. Mark kept me close, shielding me in that protective way older siblings sometimes have even when they're scared themselves. When we got home, Mark told our mom everything before I even had the chance to speak. She didn't yell or panic the way I expected. She just listened, her hands still, her face tight with anger she didn't want me to see. The next morning, she went to the community center and spoke with someone in charge. I wasn't in the room, but I could hear the edge in her voice through the thin office walls. Whatever she said must have hit hard, because 2 days later the man wasn't around anymore. His name was taken off the volunteer board, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. As a kid, I assumed adults handled everything behind the scenes, and that was the end of it. But now, looking back, I realize how close things came to becoming something much darker. Sometimes when I think about it, I picture that dim room with the buzzing light and the way he stood between me and the door. Then I think about Mark, 12 years old, sprinting across the playground because he realized his little sister had been gone too long. If he and his friends hadn't shown up when they did, I genuinely don't know what would have happened. All I know is he disappeared from our neighborhood after that day, and no one ever spoke his name again. When I think back to that night, I still remember how excited I'd been just to be there. I was 10, and staying over at my friend Lucas's house felt like stepping into a world that wasn't mine. Different smells, different routines. Even the way his mom stacked the cereal boxes felt unfamiliar in a good way. I'd known Lucas from school, but this was the first time our parents agreed to let me sleep over. We spent the whole afternoon playing video games in his room, eating microwave popcorn his mom made, and arguing about which monster was scarier in a movie we definitely weren't supposed to watch. By the time we settled down for bed, the house felt comfortable enough that I didn't think twice about being away from home. Lucas slept in this wooden twin bed that creaked every time he moved, and I had a sleeping bag laid out on a rug with little planets printed all over it. His room wasn't big, but it felt cozy. There was a nightlight shaped like a baseball on his dresser, casting this warm, soft glow across the walls. I remember lying there, listening to the distant hum of the fridge downstairs and the occasional passing car outside. For a while, nothing felt strange at all. It was the kind of night that should have been easy, the kind where a kid just drifts off without thinking about anything scary. Sometime in the middle of the night, I snapped awake without knowing why. It wasn't from a nightmare, and it wasn't a noise. Not at first. It was just that weird shift when your mind suddenly flicks back on. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light in the room. Lucas was turned toward the wall, breathing slow and steady. I remember staring at his baseball nightlight, expecting everything to look the same as when we'd fallen asleep. For a minute it did. Then I heard the faintest sound, metal rubbing gently against metal, like someone easing down a door handle. The bedroom door opened just a sliver at first, barely enough to change the shape of the shadows. I assumed it was Lucas's mom checking on us. That seemed normal, so I kept my eyes mostly shut, trying to look asleep. But the door kept opening, slow and deliberate, and something about the rhythm of it felt wrong. When it finally widened enough for me to see the shape standing there, the breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Lucas's mom. The silhouette filling the doorway was much taller, with broad shoulders and the kind of stillness adults don't usually have when they're half asleep and checking on kids. He didn't move for several seconds, just watched us, like he was deciding something. Only then did I realize I didn't recognize him at all. He stepped into the room with this strange calm, like he'd done it before. The nightlight barely reached him, but I could make out enough to know he wasn't anyone I'd seen around their house earlier. His clothes looked dark, and his posture didn't match the relaxed way Lucas's dad carried himself when he'd said goodnight hours earlier. The man moved closer to the bed, and I could hear him breathing. Slow, steady, too controlled. He leaned toward Lucas and whispered something, a short string of words I couldn't make out, like he was speaking through clenched teeth. Lucas didn't respond, didn't stir at all. His stillness made everything feel even stranger. The man leaned in again, whispering deeper this time, as if expecting an answer that never came. I kept my face angled toward the wall, pretending to sleep but watching him through the smallest slit of vision I could get away with. The man straightened up and turned his attention toward me. I didn't know why at the time, but the way he shifted his weight felt intentional, almost rehearsed. He walked slowly across the room, his shoes making barely any sound against the carpet. I could smell something faint on him, like old cologne mixed with damp fabric. He crouched next to my sleeping bag, close enough that I could see the outline of his knees pressing into the rug. I didn't dare breathe too deeply. I focused on keeping my chest rising in the same soft rhythm as before, terrified he'd notice any change. He stayed crouched there longer than felt human. I didn't hear him whisper anything to me, but I could sense him examining me, the way someone sizes up a photograph or a locked door. I kept waiting for him to touch my shoulder or shake me awake, but he didn't. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to study my face in the low light. At that moment, every instinct I had screamed to bolt out of that sleeping bag, but I knew any sudden move might bring his full attention onto me in a way I couldn't handle. The seconds stretched out so far, they barely felt real. When he finally shifted back, I took it as my only chance. I waited for the soft creak his knees made as he stood, quiet, but enough for me to know he wasn't hovering over me anymore. Without lifting my head, I slowly inched my hand toward the edge of the sleeping bag, gathering the fabric just enough so it wouldn't drag loudly when I got up. Lucas's bed made its usual little groan as he breathed, which gave me a tiny bit of ambient noise to mask my own movements. I eased myself upward, keeping my steps feather-light as I backed away from the man's shadow. The door was only a few feet away, but it felt like crossing a football field. Once I slipped through the doorway, I didn't stop. I walked down the hallway on my toes until I reached the coat closet near the stairs and tucked myself inside, pulling the door closed just enough to leave a narrow gap for air. Inside that closet, Every sound in the house seemed 10 times louder. I could hear the faint tick of a wall clock downstairs and the occasional pop from the heating system, but none of it masked the noise I dreaded most. Footsteps moving slowly across the hallway carpet. They weren't rushed or confused. They moved with a steady rhythm, like someone who knew exactly where each board of the floor was and which ones wouldn't creak. I kept my eye close to the thin line of space between the door and the frame, trying to catch any sign of movement. At one point, a shadow glided across the opposite wall. Long, slanted, unmistakably human. I pressed myself deeper between a winter coat and a stack of shoeboxes, hoping the narrow space would muffle any tiny sound I made. Minutes dragged into what felt like an hour. Every now and then the house settled, making soft groans that made my throat tighten. I thought about waking Lucas or calling for his parents, but the man's calm presence in the room earlier told me he wasn't afraid of being discovered. It felt safer to stay hidden than to risk crossing the hallway again. My legs grew stiff from being curled up, and the coats brushed against my face with every nervous breath I let out, carrying smells of fabric softener and cold dust. I kept picturing Lucas still asleep in that room with the nightlight casting its weak glow, unaware of the figure that had stood inches from him. Eventually, the footsteps faded, replaced by a heavy silence that didn't feel reassuring. It was the kind of quiet that makes you question if someone is standing still nearby, waiting. I stayed exactly where I was, keeping count in my head to distract myself. When I reached what I guessed might have been 30 minutes, I considered peeking out again, but my fear of that tall shadow reappearing held me still. Around that time, a distant sound reached me, the soft rumble of a car passing on the street outside. That little reminder of the outside world made me feel like morning wasn't impossibly far away. Still, I didn't leave the closet until I saw the first sliver of daylight creeping under the hallway trim. When the sun finally softened the corners of the house, I eased the door open and stepped out, legs tingling with pins of numbness. The hallway looked ordinary again, almost disappointingly normal. I walked back to Lucas's room, expecting chaos, tossed blankets, open drawers, something. But nothing was out of place. Lucas was still asleep, curled toward the wall, his breathing as steady as it had been hours earlier. I checked the rest of the house quietly. Kitchen empty, living room untouched, front door still locked. When Lucas's mom eventually came downstairs and found me sitting at the dining table, she looked confused when I asked if anyone else had been home. Her answer was so confident, so casual, that it didn't fit at all with what I'd seen. She said only the three of them lived there, and no one had visited that night. She even smiled gently, assuming I'd had a bad dream. That morning, I didn't know how to push back or explain it in a way an adult would believe. I just nodded and gathered my things, waiting for my parents to pick me up. Lucas woke up cheerful, completely unaware anything strange had happened. I watched him eat his cereal like nothing in his world had shifted overnight. To this day, I've never figured out who that man was or why he walked into that room so quietly. All I know is that I learned something that night. Sometimes the scariest moments aren't the ones that come with noise or chaos. They're the ones that slip in unnoticed, linger just long enough to change you, and vanish before anyone else even realizes they were there.